cold blood and then continuing to shoot him at least 15 times. Deputy Goforth is white and Miles is black. Miles also has a history of arrests and weapons charges. He was declared mentally incompetent by the state of Texas back in 2012 and spent some time in the North Texas State Hospital. But as law enforcement and the community of Harris County grieve the loss of Deputy Goforth, the public conversation about his death has become a moment of political commentary, not about mental health care accessibility or the ready availability of guns, but about this.
So at any point when the rhetoric ramps up to the point where calculated, cold-blooded assassination of police officers happened, this rhetoric has gotten out of control. We've heard Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Well, cops' lives matter too. So why don't we just drop the qualifier and just say lives matter?
Now, others have gone further than Sheriff Hickman, directly laying the responsibility for this crime at the feet of Black Lives Matter. Listen to Elizabeth Hasselbeck of Fox and Friends, who asked this of her guest on Monday.
Why has the Black Lives Matter movement not been classified yet as a hate group? I mean, how much more has to go in this direction before someone actually labels it as such?
Now, Hasselbeck and other media professionals have borne the brunt of displeasure articulated by those outraged by the suggestion that Black Lives Matter is a hate group, with some blaming implicit or explicit racial bias for this characterization of the movement. Allow me to offer a slightly different theory. German sociologist Max Weber defined the state as the entity with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, force, and coercion. All right, that's hard, so let me make it a little bit clearer. If I jump out of my car and handcuff you and put you in a cell, it's called kidnapping. If the state does it, we call it arrest. And the distinction is not just semantic, it's substantive. Even the godmother of teeny-tiny government libertarianism, Ayn Rand, believes that government must have this monopoly on violence and force. She writes, quote, "The only proper function of a government are the police to protect you from criminals, the army to protect you from foreign invaders, and the courts to protect your property and contracts from breach or fraud by others." The police, the army, violence, force, coercion. What makes a government and makes it strong and stable is when the people who are governed by it believe that the government's use of violence is legitimate. So, when the people instead declare that the state power, especially as embodied in its police, is no longer legitimate, that its use of violence, force, and coercion is biased and should be questioned, well, it sets up an existential dilemma. Because if those citizens succeed in convincing others that the state's violence is illegitimate, then the state can lose its power to govern. Just more than 50 years ago, the nonviolent direct action of voting rights activists provoked brutal violence from Southern authorities. And when Americans saw the unprovoked viciousness of these police, it changed the country's opinion about the legitimacy of Southern police, eventually resulting in the destruction of the Jim Crow legal code and voting restrictions, which had stood for nearly 100 years. Undoubtedly, this is why King and others were monitored, harassed, and threatened by the FBI. Tactics deployed by the FBI to even greater effect later in the 1960s against the Black Panther Party. The 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party even more forthrightly decried the use of force in black communities as illegitimate. And unlike the Black Lives Matter movement, the Panthers engaged in actual shootouts with police. Law enforcement, including the FBI, sought to delegitimize and destroy the Panthers. Now, this impulse toward official backlash against those who challenge, even symbolically, the state's monopoly on legitimate violence is even a driving plot element of the #1 movie in the country right now, Straight Outta Compton, which highlights police and FBI harassment of the hip-hop group NWA in response to their rap lyrics declaring, "F the police." It is not surprising to see the current effort to frame Black Lives Matter as dangerous and illegitimate. Recall what happened to New York Mayor Bill de Blasio at the end of 2014. Black Lives Matter protests gripped the city after a Staten Island grand jury declined to indict the officers involved in the chokehold death of Eric Garner. Now, having witnessed militarized response to protesters in Ferguson earlier in the year, de Blasio struck a decidedly different tone, invoking his own experiences of raising a black son.
Couldn't help but immediately think what it would mean to me to lose Dante. Life could never be the same thereafter. No family should have to go through what the Garner family went through. Shirlane and I have had to talk to Dante for years about the dangers that he may face. It's a phrase that should never have to be said. It should be self-evident. But our history, sadly, requires us to say that Black Lives Matter.
Many officers were furious that the mayor appeared to challenge the legitimacy of their actions. And then 2 officers were murdered while sitting in their patrol call in Brooklyn. And the gunman, who took his own life, had made social media comments threatening to kill officers in retaliation for the non-indictment decisions in the Eric Garner and Michael Brown cases. So, when Mayor de Blasio arrived at the hospital to see the officers' families, and when he spoke at their funeral, some in the NYPD turned their backs on him. The mayor, their boss. This is a struggle that spans American history. A people challenging the legitimacy of the state's use of violence when policing their communities, and then a backlash as the state seeks to discredit those who challenge it. What happens in that struggle determines who we become. Joining me now, Monica Dennis, Regional Coordinator for Black Lives Matter, New York City, and Niall Ford, Ordained Minister and Community Organizer. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So, we know at this point Black Lives Matter has been called or suggested to be a hate group. And I just want to suggest that maybe the most troubling part about that is the idea that it is a group, right? Black Lives Matter is a movement. So can you just help me to think about what the response within Black Lives Matter has been to this discourse?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we think it's important to highlight is that Black Lives Matter, the movement, started in direct response to violence. So we're not a hate group. We are not about violence. We're actually taking a stand against the violence that's inflicted upon our communities. And as you laid out, it's important to kind of put this in a proper context, that any time that Black people and Black communities decide to be self-determining and to resist the violence that is inflicted against us, we are cited as agitators, as hyper-violent. And so if the state sees itself as the entity that is responsible for protecting American citizenry, then we also have to look at who the state defines as hyper-violent, hyper-criminal, hyper-immoral, and that's often Black bodies.
And this idea about both the state and so many others is kind of defining Black bodies, maybe even particularly Black youth, as hyper-violent and criminal, easily delegitimized. I worry that this discourse is now, because that's available, now has the ability of undermining the movement.
Right, and to piggyback off what Monica said, I think what's really important is getting the narrative right. And the narrative from the movement has always been that we're not anti-police, but we're anti-police brutality, right? And so we are not a movement about harming police. We are a movement about holding police accountable, because police as an institution systemically and disproportionately harm communities of color, particularly Black communities across the country. So I think getting that narrative is important.
So clearly part of what happens in a narrative moment like that, especially in the land of television and radio and where little segments and pieces can be pulled out, is if there is someone at a Black Lives Matter rally who is using words like pig or talking about violence against police, or if an individual in fact does shoot and kill police officers and then in any way indicates a connection back, even just through social media, it suddenly has this wide impact on the movement.
Absolutely. So I think the focus should be is why are the actions of individual Black people then become the representation and the responsibility of all Black people? So when we see Dylan Roof or Jeffrey Dahmer or anybody committing crimes against people of color, or particularly Black people, white people are not held accountable in mass for those actions or held responsible. So we really want to refocus on not the individual actions, but actually what is actually happening to Black communities that we find ourselves historically and currently under this state of constant hostility and duress by law enforcement.
I can remember when the officers were killed in New York. I thought to myself, well, this now Black Lives Matter will be over because it can't sustain through kind of the death of officers. It's too much of a symbol. But then it wasn't over, and it's kind of managed to maintain. But I do wonder within the movement itself if there are conversations about sort of strategic changes or sort of ways to respond in moments like this.
Well, absolutely. I think what's really important is to highlight the work that's being done. So rhetoric is very important and narratives are important, but even when we talk about the Black Panther Party, one of the things that really solidified the community was the programs that they had, right? So what they call survival programs, and they called it survival pending revolution, right? And so it's important to talk about rhetoric, but it's also important to talk about the everyday work that's being done in these communities, that no matter what Fox is saying, no matter what the right-wing community media is saying we have people in communities that are meeting people's everyday needs and connecting that to a larger struggle to transform communities. And that's what people want to see, and that's what people are connecting to.
And just to put that in the clearest terms, those programs were things like breakfast programs for hungry children, health clinics, right? That's what the Panthers were doing. So what does that look like in the Black Lives Matter movement? What are those survival programs that are part of it?
Absolutely. So Niall definitely runs a books and breakfast program, and there are quite a few numbers of those books and breakfast programs across the country. Those look like teach-ins, those look like public community engagement, it looks like safety beyond policing, it looks like a lot of organizing that is happening locally and that is also happening nationally. So that's part of it. And also I think it's important for us to highlight the impact this actually has, this rhetoric, which is more than rhetoric, I'd like to suggest, because it is backed by the force of politicians, media, and law enforcement. What does it mean when the majority of the labor and leadership of this movement is coming from black women and girls, cis and trans? And so when we are saying that these people need to be surveilled more and they're inciting violence, then we're actually targeting black women and girls very, very specifically, very, very directly.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and sit. I think you're right. This isn't just about rhetoric. This is substantively a turning point moment that has to be addressed. And so I appreciate you being here to do some of that addressing. Thank you to Monica Dennis and Niall Ford. But we are not over with this conversation, because when we come back, Race Talk, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and President Obama on the police.